without further ado, I'm delighted to give you today's speaker, Chiara Destri, who is currently a fellow at the University of Frankfurt. Chiara, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Manuela, and well, thank you for having my paper included in this wonderful series. I have very quickly something to say about the paper that, as you can see right now, it's a reaction paper. So it will require to be restructured, and it will require some heavy editing. So I guess that the things that I care about and that I think are important from this paper are the following 3 or 4, I would say. First of all, there has been a rising number of people of scholars who have started to not only to offer lotteries as a supplement or addendum to electoral democracy, but as a replacement. I'm thinking primarily of Landemore, who is the main target of the paper. And so my question was, is there anything that we can say about elections and why elections specifically are worth preserving? And so this is, let's say, the main ambition of the paper. And I think that there are 2 possible objections against elections that have been raised in the debate. So one is to say that elections are inherently inegalitarian because they instantiate what is called the principle of distinction. And another argument is that they are less egalitarian than lotteries. And what I would like to do is to basically reply to both objections by saying that the fact that elections instantiate the principle of distinction is not anti-democratic or not necessarily inegalitarian, and that elections are actually better than lotteries at selecting office holders, because they give basically to the people at large the opportunity to both authorize and select on the one hand, and hold accountable representatives. And I think that these elements are not marginal aspects of representative democracy, but are actually core features of representative democracy. So actually, if we want representative democracy, which inevitably instantiates a form of vertical inequality between those who exercise power and those who are object of someone else's exercise of power, then these principles, authorization and accountability, matter. And something that I only say at the end of the paper, but I think it's worth trying to emphasize a bit more in the introduction, and then I'm done. So I think that the way these 2 principles matter for democracy can be, let's say, made more evident by focusing on the temporal dimension of political equality. And so what I think that lotteries do is that they, of course, defenders of lotteries generally have in mind political equality in the sense of an equal chance of being selected as an office holder. And what they don't, I think, they don't pay enough attention to is the fact that there is, if you want, a T1 and a T2, and the T1 is the moment of selection, and there we are all equals. But then there is a T2 when the selection has been done, and there is formal inequality, vertical inequality between some people who have been selected and others who haven't been selected. And what lotteries do is that they maximize the equality at the first stage, but they minimize any form of equality at the second stage, because they don't give to the rest of the people who haven't been selected any form of power to react to office holders. And this power is basically accountability. And the lacking of this power means that the people who haven't been selected don't have any power to hold those who have been selected into account and this is what matters. And then the second thing is that concerning the principle of distinction, I think the principle itself is not inegalitarian, or at least it's not anti-democratic, because basically instead of saying that the distribution of offices should be impartial, as supporters of lottery say, the principle of distinction, or at least that democratic reading of the principle of distinction, would basically state that the distribution of offices in a representative democracy should be sensitive to citizens' preferences and opinions. And this is what elections and electoral democracy makes possible. So the idea that the distribution shouldn't be impartial, but rather it's good that it's not impartial as long as it is sensitive to the citizens' preferences. And finally, one very last point. Of course, here I have in mind electoral democracy. I mean, I don't want to say in a completely ideal theory of electoral democracy, but of course, I'm thinking a well-functioning form of electoral democracy. And of course, there are reasonable, sensible, perfectly justified objections against the ways elections are instantiated in many contemporary democracies. And what I have in mind in particular is political finance that can be objectionable in different contemporary democratic democracy. But I think that this is not a form of objection, well, a type of objection that I can really take into account here, in the sense that it depends on how elections ought to be institutionalized in order to correspond, in order to fulfill these principles of authorization and accountability, and not the fact that authorization and accountability are a core principles for representative democracy, which is what I have. It's the kind of the object that I'm trying to deal with here. I think that's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your feedback and comments and objections.
Thank you very much, Chiara. So you know the house rules. So whoever wants to go first, please use the chat to manifest yourself. Andre.
Thanks a lot, Chiara. Really enjoyed the paper. Although it feels a bit, it was a bit extreme in the tone. I will just say that in the way you kind of like grapple with Landemore. So some people might be rubbed the wrong way yeah, it felt a bit of too much of a frontal attack, but I think it's because it's an early draft. That's a kind of a reaction that I had to the prose, let's say. I really enjoyed the paper, and I think there's a lot in there. Can I just ask one general question, or can I just ask a general question in a small one? Emmanuel.
You asked me. No, please go ahead.
Okay.
There's just 3 people, including you, in the list so far, so we have the time. So please.
So the more general question is, and this is in the context of kind of classic debates about the impossibility theorem. So if democracy is a set of values, so not just transparency, inclusiveness, and so on, is a set of values that, at least in some cases, cannot be jointly satisfied, then what does it mean to say that an institution is democratic? Because a lot in this debate, both on the Landemore side and on the side of your critique, plays on an institution being democratic. But then if you come to that debate through debates and discussions about democratic values not always being jointly satisfiable, impossibility theorem and all that, then I wonder what does that mean actually, to say that an institution is democratic or not. And this I'm thinking about in the context of Arash Abizadeh's also recent work on randomly selected Senate coupled with elected House of Representatives, where he basically says, look, here's a list of democratic values. Plutocracies, randomization is good at realizing equality of some kind, is not good at dealing with agency and other values. Let's have both, right? So I'm wondering whether, in the context of that debate, talking about something being democratic or not doesn't risk resulting in a debate where people just talk at least partly past each other. And then the second small question is Lopez Guerra's disenfranchisement or enfranchisement lottery, depending on how you look at it. I was wondering, what do you think about that institutional proposal? Because it seems to combine elections with autocracies sometimes, or randomly selecting the electors, not the representatives. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Andre, for both questions. I have to say, starting from the last one, I haven't made my mind up yet about this, in the sense that I think that there are good reasons to have universal suffrage for everyone, exactly because I think that the vote is important in order to realize that form of accountability collectively to the people that would be missing in the case of enfranchisement lottery. But I need to think more about that. And so this is just a hint more than a proper, well-thought position. Concerning your first question, thank you for the question. I think, so first of all, that's something I didn't say in the introduction, but it's important to say. Of course, in a way, it's very difficult to grapple with issues of democraticity of specific institutions, and in this case of specific selection procedures, in the sense that they are supposed to be part of a complex system of institutions that is supposed to be democratic as a whole rather than democratic in every single element, right? And so it's perfectly sensible to say, well, look, certain institutions and certain selection procedures will track certain values, but not others. So in a way, in principle, I'm completely on board with this systemic view of contemporary and representative democracy. But at the same time, Abizadeh, in that article, for instance, while he offers lotteries as a supplement to electoral democracy, he still supports a specific line of criticism of elections in which he says that elections are inegalitarian. So I think that there's still something to be said concerning elections and whether they are simply an aristocratic counterpart to democracy that we might need for whatever reasons, but it's only extrinsically necessary to realize representative democracy. And I think that's Abizadeh's more or less position, or I mean, not necessarily, but let's say that that elections are necessary for, or at least they realize the value of political agency, but they don't realize and actually hinder the value of political equality for Abizadeh. And that's why he thinks that we need both elections and lotteries. And I disagree with that position in the sense that I think that elections can be egalitarian insofar as they allow citizens to decide on the distribution of offices. And so insofar as they make the distribution of offices sensitive to citizens' preferences, which is something that, of course, lotteries by definition cannot do. And I think that that element that is generally called, following Bernard Manin in the debate, the principle of distinction, that element is not anti-egalitarian, I think, and this is one of the things I want to claim. Then I'm not, of course, this is not like the paper that you read is not a proper paper. Again, it's a reaction paper, so it will need to be extensively rewritten in order to make something publishable out of it. But I think that what really matters for me is to say that elections have democratic value in themselves, even if they can be used together with other selection procedures for other for other roles or in other ways that are not elections but are rather selections. So there are rather lotteries. So I'm not saying that we should never ever have lotteries, nor am I saying that lotteries and elections can't be used together, as for instance Abizadeh claims. What I'm simply saying is, if we want to do that, we shouldn't do that because elections are inherently inegalitarian. We can do that because, for instance, elections as they are nowadays realized, inevitably will kind of because we have a lot of problems with political finance and all the rest, then yes, we need something as a counter element to election, and these might be lotteries, but it's not in principle that elections are inegalitarian, and that is why I think it's important to defend their inherent democratic character. Thanks for the question.
Okay, so next in line is Giulia Jacobi.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I have more a comment than a question, because I am working on a very similar topic in my PhD thesis at the University of Hamburg. And while I was reading the paper, I was wondering, I mean, as you said, it is, as it is now, rather a response to Landemore. But I was really surprised that you do not engage more with Guerrero's arguments, because he explicitly states, I mean, the core of his argument is that the accountability function that elections are said to have simply does not work, because topics are too complex and people are too uninformed. And even if the system, even if we think about elections in a rather ideal system, it is just not plausible that this accountability function would work. And I mean, by now your article focuses mainly on the egalitarian value of elections, and I find that convincing. But like, I was surprised that you do not say anything about the fact that there are really good arguments that challenge the accountability function of elections. I mean, you say something about it, but you do not really engage with the latest arguments, I think.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for the comment. You're right, I don't do it right now, and that's something I need to be doing, clearly, to develop a full-fledged argument in favor of elections, especially because I think that accountability matters that much. So the things that I can say about Guerrero in particular, well, first of all, his argument in favor of lotteries is more an epistemic argument, in the sense that he has both. He says, well, we should want responsiveness and we should want epistemic quality. Elections, if I remember correctly, I'm not sure, but correct me if I'm wrong. So if we want responsiveness, actually elections are unable to give us that, because the strong accountability doesn't work. And if we want epistemic quality, lotteries are better than elections at doing that. So since we cannot have responsiveness anyways, let's go for lotteries, because lotteries realize epistemic quality. So this is the main reason why I set him aside, in the sense that he doesn't have an egalitarian argument in favor of lotteries, but rather an epistemic one. So the claim is that it's epistemically better to select people at random and then have them decide together with the help of experts and through deliberation, rather than electing someone in particular. So this is the reason why I put his account aside. But you're right, then I will have to say something about whether elections are really able to do the accountability part. On that, two things. First, all the arguments that Guerrero lays out, if I remember correctly, have a lot to do with how elections are currently instantiated, rather than with the elections in principle. So in a way, of course, this is a problem if we want to set out criteria that elections must satisfy to realize those values. But in a way, that's a problem of non-ideal theory, let's say, of elections. So there's one, that's the main reason why I didn't consider his view. And then there's another thing that can be said, and that is that the selection/authorization aspect of elections can be realized regardless of whether elections are able to realize accountability also, in the sense that accountability requires retrospective voting, so requires citizens' capacity to look back at incumbents' past performance and to see if they've done what they said they would do. And we have reasons to believe that retrospective voting, or at least some people say that citizens aren't really able to engage in retrospective voting. And here I think of Acker and Bartels and their Democracy for Realists book. But this is contested, actually. And so that's one thing. But the thing is that even if we were to agree that retrospective voting doesn't really happen, and so accountability cannot happen because retrospective voting doesn't happen, which I think can be is controversial, and I don't agree it's the case. Still, elections instantiate the principle of authorization and selection. And for that, you only need prospective voting. So for that, you only need that citizens are able to look at the options and decide which option they prefer the most. And this is all that is required for elections to satisfy the idea and the principle of what I call the principle of this, well, Manin calls principle of distinction, but in general, you can call it the idea that the distribution of offices should be sensitive to citizens' preferences rather than merely impartial. So I think, yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your comment, but let me know in case if I didn't, and I'll say something more. Thanks.
Okay, so there's me in the list, and so again, I mean, mine is a comment more than a question. The first thing is that I really love your argument in the paper, and even in this form, I don't think it's too straightforward. I really like your being straightforward there. I mean, I think Landemore's argument is wrong, and you do a very nice job to show how it is. But there is an aspect that I think is very interesting, which concerns the aristocratic allegation attributed to elections. Because interestingly enough, if history of democracy has something to teach us, is that lotteries were introduced as an aristocratic mechanism. So the way in which they were introduced in Athens, for example, was not really an instantiation of political equality. So the way in which they really came into being in a democracy was as an extra democratic correction to some democratic failures. So as a matter of fact, the argument is wrong in this sense. Then normatively, a defense can be given, but the burden is on those who advocate, it seems, the distinctively democratic nature of lotteries against elections. As distinct from a non-democratic, perhaps aristocratic correction, and especially as an alternative rather than as and I think that, I'm not sure whether that's the direction in which we're going, but lotteries seems to make a lot of sense within an aristocratic setting, precisely because they lack the kind of accountability that you lament, simply because what matters there is that people belong to a certain group, and it doesn't really matter who and why within the group is elected. In your case, the argument you make seems to say that this idea of making the selection responsive to citizens' preference precisely puts the finger on this idea that it is not enough to be eligible, to be actually authorized as a political agent to make collective decisions, because citizens' preferences count, and it's not indifferent. So elections are not impersonal in the same way in which lotteries are in this sense. Just to say that if that's the direction in which you're going, there's also lots of historical interesting argument that can be brought in and can corroborate your case. But other than that, I'll also be in touch by email to share some of these things that might be of interest.
Yes, please. If you have any reference, please do share, because I didn't know. So I know that lotteries have been used, especially, for instance, in Italian republics in the Middle Age and Renaissance period. Venice is an example, as instruments that wasn't particularly democratic in itself, rather the contrary. So I knew about that, but I didn't know that they were introduced in Athens for that reason. So if you have any reference from that, that would be super helpful. Thank you. And then, yes, I mean, this is the direction, the direction that I would like the paper to take eventually is exactly to stress that the selection of office holders shouldn't be impartial. It should be sensitive to citizens' preferences. And this is why it is democratic, because those are the ones that are going to abide by the rules that office holders make. So this is exactly why it is democratic to have people select them rather than to distribute offices randomly. And I think this is what exactly is missing in all accounts of lotteries. I mean, you can see that partly in Guerrero, you can definitely see that in Landemore. But I mean, I think you can see that also in Abizade's own view, in the sense that he has a much more nuanced view. He only supports lotteries as an addendum to elections, but still he has this idea, he shares this idea that elections are inherently inegalitarian or inherently inegalitarian and non-democratic because of that, it seems, and I think that this is wrong.
Good.
So thanks.
Thank you. So we have Dominic Ostrop in the list, and then Andre again.
Yeah, thanks so much. So since we appear to have some time, I might get away with a question regarding a rather small detail. Maybe it's also just a question of comprehension. So on page 13, you make the point that if Landemore's objection is against democracies in the ideal case, then her objection might be unjustified. And then you have a footnote, I think 16, where you assume that she would respond by saying that in ideal circumstance of many publics, they're deliberative, while in ideal circumstances of democracy at large, they still aren't. But this entails that we should only trust deliberation, not because it involves ordinary citizens, but despite this fact. Now, I'm not quite sure what's the point you try to make her. So the only thing that I have in mind there is that Landemore appears to rely a lot on this diversity trumps ability theorem to do her work also in deliberation, where of course it matters whether there are ordinary citizens or some sort of epistemic selection, pre-selection. So I just don't know if I missed your point here, or like, could you elaborate a bit more on what you mean by the distinction between despite or because of? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. This is indeed very specific in the sense that I need to just try and understand what I was trying to say there. But I think the point perhaps that was incorrect as it was stated. But the point is really to say that the impression that I have from reading Landemore is that sometimes she doesn't have a lot of trust in democracy and in ordinary people. And so the point is, yes, we should give the power to ordinary people only because we expect them to be included in this deliberative process that will satisfy certain conditions so that it will fulfill the diversity trumps ability theorem. And this is why we'll have good decisions. But so the idea is not really that we should trust ordinary citizens because for whatever reasons that pertain specifically to ordinary citizens, but it's really that we should trust even ordinary citizens as long as they are put in a specific context that is a perfectly deliberative context. And so what I was trying to say that there, but not clearly, and I mean I can erase the footnote. I was trying just to say that it seems to me that she doesn't really have a lot of trust in ordinary people at all, because what matters is the context, and as long as the context is perfectly deliberative, then yes, even if we have horrible, awful citizens as the ones that we have, we still can hope for a good result. And so the thing is that what matters is really the context that is deliberative in the way she wants it to be, rather than citizens themselves. And this was just to be, in a way, to distanciate Landemore from other justifications of lotteries, like for instance John McCormick's justification of lottery, that really emphasize more this aspect of lotteries as a defense of ordinary citizens versus the elite. And I think that that's not the argument of Landemore there. It's more really about trying to realize the perfect deliberative context so that we can trust decisions by random citizens, even if they're random. Do you see what I mean? Is that clear a bit? Okay, thanks.
Andrei.
Two questions. So one, as you're responding to questions during the discussion, I think there's a very interesting point in there about actual elections, so elections as we have them, the empirical reality of it versus ideal elections. And I was wondering whether the question, to what extent the question might be turned the other way around, which is to say, and there's obviously a mistake in comparing or criticizing actual elections and then trying to replace them with an idealized alternative that would be lotocracies, either in the Guerrero form or the Landemore form. But I was wondering whether you think that Guerrero and or Landemore have given the best idealized defense of lotocracies in the sense of institutional design. It's a bit of an open question, so I apologize for that. But so if we're in the game of comparing ideal with ideal and actual with actual, I was wondering whether there are not other different kinds of arrangements that are lotocratic centered, maybe, or maybe not fully lotocracies, but also maybe fully lotocracies, where they might be preferable or on a par with elections. So if we keep the matching, right, ideal, actual. And the second point on, so, and this is kind of just nitpicking, but on page 16, when you give the quote from Pourtois, and you say lotteries, in that respect, lotteries replace an effectively equal opportunity for political participation through voting with an equal chance of political participation. My impression reading that little passage was that you're equivocating on political participation, because in one case, we are politically participating by selecting representatives. In the other case, we are legislating. And it's different types, forms of, and levels of political.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for both questions. So for the last one, you're right in the sense that it is true that in a way there is an equivocation. It's partly what Pourtois does, I think, but apart from that, I think it's important to, bear in mind the fact that while it is certainly limiting to consider political participation only as the right to vote, it is, I think, also very limiting to consider political participation only as the opportunity to hold office. And I think that Landemore, but also Abizade, both make this mistake of conflating political participation and political equality on having an equal opportunity in the sense of an equal chance to hold office. And I think that this is mistaken and this is problematically thin, because when we talk about political equality, there's much more involved. And as I was saying, at T2, after this election has taken place, non-elected citizens don't have any form of power, and so they are much more unequal compared to the ones who really hold power. So I think that there's a lack of political equality there, but also it means that the kind of political participation that as a lay citizens you are afforded in a purely autocratic system is very limited, because you, by not having the right to vote, you don't have the capacity to make your voice heard and counted in the same way, simply because, you know, formally selected autocrats are not accountable. They don't have to be, and they don't have to respond to what they've done at next election. So that's really an inherently problem of I think an inherent problem, sorry, of lotteries. And this in a way also answers the first question, in the sense that I know that there are Bernheim and Van Rijbroek's account of lotteries. I'm not familiar with those views, but as far as I know, in like mainstream political theory, let's say, Landemore is the first one who tries to offer a full-fledged account of a form of representative democracy that doesn't use elections and only employs lotteries. So as far as I know, she's very radical in that. There's also Guerrero, but Guerrero, first of all, hasn't published his book yet, so I'm still waiting for it. And in the article, I think the kind of solution to instantiate lotteries that he offers, I think, is even less plausible than Landemore's, in the sense that his idea is that you have, I don't know if you're familiar, but basically his idea is that you have different mini publics that are selected through lotteries, and each mini public will deliberate on a specific issue, which is, I mean, there's like this huge problem of agenda setting and externalities of each issue that cannot be solved in the model as it is right now. I don't know about the book. When it will be out, I'll see it and what I can say. But so yeah, in a way, even the ideal, I mean, if we take ideal forms of lotteries, I think Landemore is the most developed version that I know of, exactly because she includes autocratic selections in a wider view of open democracy, where there are also participation rights and transparency that for her are important principles. So her view is the most developed. But I think that if the point is not to see how actual elections or actual lotteries work or would work, but the point is really to see what are the values behind this selection procedure. I think there's still something that we can say, regardless of how elections are realized, about elections as a specific selection procedure compared to lottery as a specific selection procedure. So I wouldn't say that it's only about ideal and non-ideal theory, but I would say it's more, of course there's that, but I would say it's more about evaluating, assessing the principle, assessing the democratic value of a specific selection procedure. Of course, taking into account that that selection procedure will be part of a bigger scheme. But what I try to say in the paper, for instance, is that even putting lotteries as part of a bigger scheme for Landemore doesn't work, in the sense that she still cannot solve the problem of accountability, even in her larger view. So yeah, I hope I have answered. Thanks. Thank you.
There's a question from Palet, if I'm not wrong. Yes, Palet.
Yes,
please.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the interesting paper. I myself am working on very closely related questions, so this was very interesting for me to read. So my first comment is a kind of an observation, because I think we have to distinguish between two senses in which this claim that elections are inherently oligarchic or aristocratic or whatever, or inegalitarian, sorry. That there are two different meanings of that. One of which does not entail that they are necessarily also aristocratic. So first of all, you have this idea in Manon that elections imply the kind of unequal treatment of candidates by voters. So voters can vote based on arbitrary grounds like race, or that has nothing to do with the sort of substantive quality of policies. But this does not yet say anything about whether elections has a tendency to also pick superior candidates that stand out for the electorate and so forth. So these two meanings are different, right? So I think you could perhaps spell that out a little bit further in the paper. So being inherently inegalitarian does not yet imply inherently aristocratic. And my second point is, do you agree that elections logically entail the principle of distinction? I mean, because you seem to say that in your presentation now that, yeah, it's not really a problem. They are still, even if elections has this inbuilt non-empirically contingent tendency to pick superior individuals who belong to the upper strata of society, that's not a problem, because it doesn't matter who implement policies. We have these party programs and so forth. So I would like to ask you, because I think there are some people who say this is just not true. There's nothing about elections that forces us to choose people who are superior to us. I mean, we could just choose someone else. I mean, or try to create new organizations. I mean, this superior is also a kind of specification dependent term. Yeah, I mean, you can be superior along many different dimensions. So you can be superior in the sense that you are more educated. That might be some kind of aristocratic idea, but you can also be superior in the sense that you're the candidate who share my background and my experience and so forth. And my third question is then, I don't think your paper quite addresses the problem that lotocracy is supposed to be a solution to, namely that we have these electoral parliaments that across the board seem to be dominated by a particular class. And this is something that has changed over time. It has gotten worse, actually. So do you think this is a problem that we have electoral politicians, legislators with particular social backgrounds that are out of sync? And do you have any solutions to how we could get people from all walks of life into parliament? Is this a concern for you? Do you think this is a problem that our parliaments are so homogeneous?
Okay,
thank
great,
you.
thanks. Great questions, and thank you also because you gave me the opportunity to clarify something that I didn't explain clearly in my introduction. So thank you again. So yes, last question, absolutely. I think it's a problem. I'm not saying we should be happy with the situation as it is, but I think that the type of homogeneity that we see, and we do see it, and that has increased in the last 30 years, shouldn't be solved with lotteries, but should be rather solved by making elections work better and satisfy their principles better. And in that case, I mean, the most important thing I think is political finance, and it's the role of the media, and we should rather focus on those things rather than trying to offer alternatives like lotteries that I don't think would really help. By the way, lotteries wouldn't really help alone, also for a reason that Abizadeh makes quite clear, that we would likely have political violence if we lacked any way to channel our interest and views in the political process, and lotteries prevent regular people from doing that. But that said, the other 2 points that I think particularly important. So first of all, I wasn't clear in my introduction. When I talk about principle of distinction, I meant to use it in the sense of an equal treatment of candidates by voters. And the idea is to say that unequal treatment is fine in the sense that it shouldn't be equal treatment by voters. It should be treatment that is discriminatory simply because in the neutral sense of being done in like a selection that is done in absolute freedom by citizens. So in that sense, I meant principle of distinction, and I use it to say that it's a good thing that elections are sensitive to the distribution of preferences of citizens. So I used it in that sense. But of course, you're right to point out that this is not the way Bernard Manin used the term and coined the term. And so in his view, elections are both at the same time an aristocratic and a democratic selection procedure. And the reason why they are both aristocratic and democratic at the same time, if I remember correctly, is that they instantiate this principle of distinction, but they do it according to the lights of the people themselves. So in a way, this second aspect, that is the one that I emphasize, is the democratic aspect of elections, according to Manin himself, while the first aspect is the aristocratic element of elections. And he goes on and says that elections are aristocratic because they basically, it's not simply that citizens are free to make whatever decision they want, but also that the specific type of situation that elections instantiate is a situation in which they must make a choice based on salience of the personal features of candidates. And so actually the context that Manin has in mind, in my view, is basically the early representative context of elections of individual candidates unattached to particular parties. And while this might still be true for presidential contests, I think it's not a good description of what happens in parliamentary elections, where each candidate is actually a candidate that is a member of a party with a party program, and in certain countries, and this is particularly important because in certain countries you don't even know the person you're selecting, you're just voting for the party without knowing the personal features of the specific candidate. And so in that sense, I think that Manin's argument is in a way a bit like anachronistic, because it cannot really track, let's say, the features of contemporary and parliamentary elections in party mass democracies, even though he recognizes at the end of the book that the type of electoral democracy that has developed after the liberal model was the party model, and still I don't think he really acknowledges that in his view of elections. And so in that sense, no, candidates don't need to be superior, because I think that what matters is not personal features, but rather the party program that candidates claim to endorse. And so in that respect, I don't think that elections are or should be aristocratic in the sense of selecting superior candidates. So I would say that they are neither aristocratic nor inegalitarian. But you're right that the two things can be separate, can be considered independently, and elections being egalitarian doesn't necessarily mean that they're also aristocratic. I think that they're neither. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you for the question.
Carlo.
Yes. Obviously, we talked about this a little bit, but one thing in particular that came up during Emanuela's comment, I was thinking about another dimension of historicity of election, and that is that, to my knowledge, but maybe I'm wrong, there weren't many people interested in campaigning for having lotteries, and the whole point about democratizing was campaigning for having one's voice heard and having an election, basically. So I was wondering if this, obviously one doesn't need to pay too much attention to history, right? Perhaps everybody was wrong and they should have campaigned and should have fought for having lottery and not elections after all. But it seems quite curious that that dimension was absent, even though lotteries were used in Athens, for example. And then another thing I was mentioning, I was wondering whether you could put even more rhetorical pressure on Landemore by raising a more radical example. So what would she say about randomly selecting a king, an absolute monarch? You can think of constitutional monarchy, the situation where you elect a king and that king rules for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, and you can select a king by lottery. It seems quite plausible to see that the constitutional king is much better than the king selected at random, right? And of course, I imagine Landemore has all other institutional provisions to ensure that the randomly selected lot, as opposed to a single person, has more epistemic validity or whatever. But it seems that if she only cares about the equality in the random selection, then she must be committed to at least a little bit claim that the randomly selected monarch is a case in which some equality has been part of the system. So I was wondering if this is a useful example or maybe not.
Great, thanks. So you're right that campaign for more democratization has always meant campaign for the vote and for universal suffrage rather than lotteries. So I think that's a nice parallel. Well, this analogy actually there. Concerning your second point, I don't think so. In principle, it is true that at T1, if the question is, should we elect a king, at T1, everyone would have the same chances of being selected. But I think that this wouldn't be entirely fair to Landemore, in the sense that her point is to try and maximize political equality. And in fact, she says that in principle, her model should have various mini-publics, multiple mini-publics, in all aspects of the administration, from local to national, and that everyone should have, and these mini-publics should rotate so that everyone really has not only an equal chance of being selected, but a non-completely random possibility of actually exercising the political power that they have, that they may have. So in that sense, it is true that I think this objection wouldn't be entirely fair to Landemore. And then I'm seeing Andre's comment. The king is one, and the argument for the selection groups are represented. This is interesting because actually I don't think this is true for Guerrero, but not necessarily for Landemore, in the sense that she doesn't run the descriptive representation argument as much. She mentions it, but and this is certainly the case of Abizadeh as well, but her view of representation is really formalistic. I mean, she endorses Riffel's view of representation, according to which basically a representative is whomever an audience recognizes as a representative, and therefore no further requirements of similarity or descriptive of similarity between the people selected and the rest of the population is needed for the representation process to be legit, to be democratic for Landemore, in the sense that she says basically that all representative democracy necessarily instantiates some form of vertical inequality, and we know that, of course, and that what matters for that form of representation is that the selection process itself is respects equality and inclusion. But as long as it respects equality and inclusion, then the process is democratic for Landemore, and it doesn't need to respect also descriptive representation. This is, of course, inevitable if you use lotteries, but it's not what makes the representation democratic for Landemore, I think, in the sense that she really endorses this formalistic view of representation, according to which a representative, well, basically representing means being a representative, and what matters is that the selection procedure itself is respects equality and inclusion. So of course you need democratic representation for her epistemic argument. So if you want epistemically sound decisions, then you need descriptive representation, simply because you need diversity. But I think that the two arguments, if I remember that chapter correctly, the two arguments are different, in the sense that the reason why representation is democratic is that it respects equality and inclusion. And the reason why mini publics are epistemically reliable is that they are diverse, and the fact that they are descriptively representative ensures that they are diverse. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't. What do you think? Does it? Does it not?
I still think Landemore tries to come close to something that is descriptively representative. She just admits that there will always be blind spots and biases no matter what form of representation you adopt. So I would not, she has this fourth principle, democratic representation, where lotocratic representation is one of them. And I would certainly think that her ambition is to approximate something as descriptive representation in order to include different perspectives and interests and so forth in the political process. So I disagree a little bit with your interpretation there.
But it's interesting because she doesn't say that the descriptive, so she doesn't say that representation is democratic if it is descriptive. She says that representation is democratic if it respects equality and inclusion. And then we may think that if it respects equality and inclusion, it will also be descriptive.
Yeah, but what is it that inclusion adds to equality in that argument then? If not inclusion of different interests and perspectives in the lotocratic assembly. I mean, then
of course. No, of course. But what I'm saying is that she doesn't have the stronger view that you need, because I mean, you can think of a stronger argument for descriptive representation, right? That you should want descriptive representation for descriptive, for the sake of descriptive representation. And instead, it seems to me that she says, well, descriptive representation is what you get if you have equality and inclusion. And as long as you have equality and inclusion, you will get some form of descriptive representation. But it's not that the aim should be descriptive representation. Maybe you're saying the same thing, but sorry. Okay, thanks.
Okay, very good. And this excellent exchange brings us at the end of our session. So thank you very much, Chiara, for your talk and for sharing with us your paper. And I'll just remind you that the next meeting of the seminar is at the end of May, 25th of May, if I'm not wrong. So you'll be receiving, as always, the information as soon as the material becomes available. And thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening.
Thank you a lot for all your comments and questions. Really, it was great. Thanks a lot.